Eran las 3 de la mañana, 3 de enero en el calendario. Caracas dormía tranquila bajo su manto diario, pero el cielo no trajo sol, trajo un ruido de metal, y en Fuerte Tiuna se rompió el silencio habitual. No fueron truenos de lluvia, fueron botas extranjeras que cruzaron sin permiso nuestras líneas y fronteras. La noticia corre como pólvora, la pantalla se congela. Se han llevado al presidente, hay fuego en Venezuela. Liberen a Nicolás, grita una parte del mapa, mientras la garra del norte su sentencia destapa. Dicen que va hacia el norte sobre el mar prisionero, en las entrañas de acero de un buque extranjero. Que el mundo se detenga, que nadie quede mudo, hoy la historia se parte. Liberen a Maduro. Hoy en Moscú escuchas el eco en el Caribe. Si cae un socio el equilibrio no sobrevive. Pekín levanta la vista, el dragón debe mirar que las flotas del imperio han vuelto a navegar. Hermano en La Habana, sandinista en Nicaragua, saben que esta misma lluvia mañana será su agua. Si hoy tocan a uno y lo sacan de su cama, mañana su justicia incendiará toda la rama. Dicen que el Iwo Jima navega con la presa, que van rumbo a Nueva York a servirlo en la mesa. Trump firma la orden, Petro mira con espanto. ¿Es justicia o es venganza lo que cubre con su manto? Las bombas en la Carlota dejaron su marca en el suelo. Un pájaro de hierro se lo llevó en pleno vuelo. Para el que celebra en Miami, para el que llora en el barrio, esto no es solo un hombre, es un cambio de escenario. La soberanía sangra cuando el juez es el verdugo, y la libertad no nace bajo la sombra del yugo. Venezolano, despierta, sea cual sea tu color. Hoy tu tierra fue pisada por la bota del invasor. El mundo aguanta la respiración, la moneda está en el aire. Nadie sabe el costo, nadie sabe el desaire. Desde el sur hasta el oriente, el mensaje es duro. Me respetan a los pueblos, me liberen a Maduro. Me respetan a los pueblos, me liberen a Maduro.
Y hoy ese es el mensaje, que este pueblo quiere esta revolución, quiere su independencia, con todos los problemas, pero que no queremos guerra, pero tampoco vamos a pedir de rodillas nada.
Cubans across the country have joined a petition drive to reaffirm their desire for peace and express their rejection of the Trump administration's threats of war against Cuba. Mi Firma por la Patria, or My Signature for the Homeland, is an initiative launched by President Miguel Díaz-Canel that seeks to demonstrate the unity of the Cuban people during a time of tension and serious intimidation coming from Washington.
Bueno, creo que es un deber como todo revolucionario apoyar a nuestra nación en estos momentos tan complejos que estamos viviendo. Y nada, mi firma también tenía que estar estampada aquí en este documento.
Es una firma por la paz, que es lo fundamental, y también refleja ese sentimiento de unidad de los cubanos por defender la soberanía y la independencia que tanto nos ha costado a lo largo de muchos años de lucha revolucionaria.
Primero por mis ancestros, por tantos mártires, por Cuba, por Venezuela, por la América, por Europa, por el mundo.
The petition aims to show the world that regardless of political ideologies, the majority of Cubans do not want military aggression from the United States. For this reason, members of the private sector in Cuba have also joined the initiative.
Primero que todo, yo creo que ningún cubano quiere que haya una intervención militar en Cuba. Y segundo, porque el bloqueo tanto al sector estatal como al no estatal nos está afectando en diversas maneras. Hoy son días con mucha incertidumbre, mucha gente con miedo de una guerra, si vienen, si no vienen. Entonces eso como quiera causa pánico en general a la población.
The Trump administration's lack of diplomacy has not gone unnoticed by Cubans, who recognize that they are under a real threat.
Hay una amenaza real de que un escenario similar de agresión o de intento de intervención militar en Cuba pueda suceder. Pero realmente nosotros lo que nos toca hoy como pueblo, como nación, es defender la soberanía al costo incluso de nuestras vidas.
And although they insist they don't want a war with the United States, they say they are willing to give their lives for their country if necessary. ¿Siente temor de que Trump cumpla con su amenaza?
No, el que tiene temor es Trump.
No, para nada, no tenemos ningún temor. Si algún día tuviésemos que dar nuestra vida por esta patria, lo vamos a dar con toda confianza.
Realmente estamos dispuestos a darlo todo porque nuestra bandera sigue ondeando con la estrella solitaria como hasta hoy.
Que esta es nuestra patria, que esta es nuestra independencia, que nos respeten y que aquí lo estamos esperando si es necesario.
All right. Hi, comrades. How you doing? Welcome to the National Network on Cuba's Revolution Within the Revolution podcast. Hopefully you can hear me. My name is Onya Sanu. I am one of 3 hosts of this podcast. I'm here by my lonesome because the other 2 hosts, Jasenia and Ormia, are currently in a liberated zone. They are in Cuba with the May Day Brigade, and we have some report back from the brigade that we're going to have in a second. But it's just going to be me today. So the Revolution Within the Revolution podcast was started by the National Network on Cuba to spread the word about what's going on in the U.S.-Cuba Solidarity Movement and beyond, as well as to give truthful updates about the U.S. war on Cuba, as well as Cuba's response. We get just so much propaganda and lying and nonsense in the U.S. I actually have an example right after this talking about Cuba. And so it's really important for those of us who are in the struggle to spread the word far and wide about what's actually happening so that people can get the reality about Cuba and so the Cuba Solidarity Movement can grow and so we can end the U.S. attacks on the Cuban Revolution. The National Network on Cuba, of course, is a coalition of U.S. based and also based in the colonies of the U.S. like Puerto Rico, organizations fighting against the U.S. blockade on Cuba, fighting all U.S. attempts to overthrow the Cuban Revolution, to hurt the Cuban people, because that's what it looks like to try to overthrow a people's revolution. You have to hurt those people quite egregiously. And so that's what we mean when we say we're trying to stop that. We're trying to stop the completely unnecessary harm the U.S. government and Western imperialism are doing to Cuban people, to Cuban socialism, to the Cuban state, to Cuban territory, etc. So we do the show every Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern time for about 90 minutes. And so that's what we're going for today, this International Workers' Day, this May 1st, being commemorated by hundreds of thousands of people all across the island of Cuba, but also all over the United States, all over the world. We have poor and working class people in the streets, building unity, building strength, building relationship, building power in order to take out this capitalist imperialist system before it takes us out. So very happy that the show happened to fall on this day. And so we're going to talk a little bit about International Workers' Day, what it means for the global struggle for justice, and also the significance of it in Cuba at this particular moment while the U.S. is escalating its attacks. We're also going to be talking about what those attacks look like. They're happening on the Trump just randomly threatening to recolonize Cuba tip. They're happening on the level of the DOD, the Department of Defense. I guess it's the Department of War now. I don't like using the terms that the Trump people make up. When they started calling it the Gulf of America, I refuse. And so I still call it the Department of Defense, even though actually Department of War is probably more accurate. I'm just I will not allow you to define my reality, Pete Hegseth. Anyway, so the Department of Defense is doing reconnaissance around the island of Cuba because these crackers say jump, and the entire military industrial complex says how high, how can we make money off this? So of course they're going to go along with it, even though it is an absurd idea. And then there's also soft power reinforcement of the Trump threats and the military attacks in the form of the U.S. media falling in line with propaganda against the Cuban Revolution, particularly Time magazine this week. And then the other dimension is, of course, the ongoing escalated U.S. blockade on Cuba, which now includes a naval blockade, an oil blockade, intentionally cutting off Cuba's access to oil that Russia broke, we'll talk about that in a second. It also includes the blockade that already existed, the listing of Cuba on the U.S. State Department's list of state sponsors of terrorism, and all the interconnecting legislation and U.S. government policies that work together to try to cut Cuba's access off from resources. So there's like this multifaceted war on Cuba going on. We're going to talk about what that looks like. And the video that we just watched from Breakthrough News, shout out to Breakthrough News, is just Cubans saying, actually, no, we don't want U.S. military intervention on our island. Actually, if y'all try anything, we are going to rise up and fight back because we refuse to be recolonized. And so we're also going to be talking about Cuba's response to all of this because it's very, very important. And there's like a lot of lessons for us in the social justice movement about how not to panic, but rather how to get organized when we observe how the Cubans respond. So, like I said, the Trump administration has made a series of like really huge unforced errors when it comes to the Israel and U.S. Attack on Iran. Iran is like whipping their butts. Hezbollah is whipping their butts. They have fully painted themselves into a corner. They have tanked the global economy, like mass suffering across the planet caused by this poor decision made on a whim by straight up colonizers and Zionists. Just take the global economy. Everybody's suffering, painted themselves in the corner. The only way out is to surrender, but their pride will not allow them to do this. So they're trying to like reconstruct a reality. They're trying to find any way they can to save face. And one of the ways that Trump has identified to save face is to start pointing the finger at Cuba. And I guarantee you, because like just like Netanyahu and the Zionist entity fed the Trump administration, just like a bunch of BS and convinced them that Iran would be a cakewalk, despite the fact that Iran has had years and years and years to get organized, to build its defenses, to understand that the U.S. cannot be trusted, and you have to make sure that you can defend yourself in order to protect yourself from these fools. Despite that, Netanyahu, the Zionist entity, sold the U.S. on the idea that Iran was going to be a cakewalk. It obviously wasn't. Now Marco Rubio is trying to sell Trump on the idea that Cuba itself can be a cakewalk. Marco Rubio has a fantasy about being like the new ruler of Cuba when it's fallen to capitalism again, a fantasy. It's not going to happen. The Cuban Revolution is not going to fall to people like this if we have anything to do with it, if the Cubans have anything to say about it. However, Trump is very gullible, so he's listening to Rubio. He's talking about Cuba might be next. Like I mentioned, the U.S. Department of Defense sent a drone to fly alongside the island of Cuba and ostensibly like document what kind of infrastructure existed to gain reconnaissance for some kind of military operation if they were to do that. And so even though it is BS, even though the narrative that Cuba is somehow a security threat to the United States is absolutely made up by the Trump administration. And even though Trump will bald-faced lie, like rapid fire, back to back to back, every single day, he still has his finger on the button. He still has the military industrial complex, the branches of the U.S. security state responding to his whims. And so we have to take this seriously again without panicking. We have to get organized. We have to get clear. We have to be serious. So that's happening again. It's like a Hail Mary of the Trump administration who has failed so hard in Iran. And the other thing that like ties military intervention in Iran for the U.S. and also the threats of U.S. military intervention against Cuba is that they represent like last ditch efforts of U.S. imperialism in decline. It is circling the drain. Like they painted themselves into a corner. The only way out is surrender. They don't have the ego. They don't have they have too much ego to do that. So it's literally just going to keep getting worse and worse and worse because they're making decisions based on a version of the world that does not exist. Where they could just like bomb nations into a submission or sanction and starve nations into submission. And those nations will just like roll over and take it. No, what we keep seeing in place after place after place in Iran, in Cuba, in the Alliance of Sahel states, in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, is that people refuse to be recolonized. Every time you try to bomb and sanction them into submission, they're going to fight back. They will literally never stop fighting back because you have made it an existential struggle. So really, you should stop. You should stop trying to dominate people, but they literally can't. So imperialism is trying to use the last tool of hegemony it has left. Like the economic hegemony is falling apart thanks to Iran and Russia and a bunch of other nations realizing that they need to build alternatives that exist independently of the U.S. So like now the U.S. is getting increasingly cut out of the economic picture. On the diplomatic and political stage, y'all have been backing the most live street genocide in history for like 3 years, like arming it, supporting it, providing cover for it. Everybody can see that. And then we find out you're all pedophiles. You're all sex pests. So like any kind of play for like moral legitimacy that backed US diplomacy is gone, And also all of their bad decisions, like I said, are tanking everybody else's economy, including that of their closest allies in Europe, in Southeast Asia, like Japan, South Korea. All the puppets are catching hell. The Philippines, all the puppets are catching hell because of the decisions of the US. Taiwan, all the puppets are catching hell because of the poor decisions of the US. And so that means, diplomatically speaking, these people are like, wow, we yoked our destiny to the United States, and they literally cannot be trusted to make decisions on even on a rational basis. On a basic level, they are really going to do the stupidest possible thing every time. This was a bad decision. So like they don't have that diplomatic push anymore. They don't got the economic push anymore. The military dominance is the last thing they have left. And even that, Iran is demonstrating, is a paper tiger. All this money spent, billions of dollars spent by the US government for military dominance. And Iran is like just whooping them with $50,000 drones. They're just like pumping out from underground. Oh my God. Like it's looking bad for the US. But this is their Hail Mary. They need control of land, peoples, and resources in order to maintain their dominance. Like understand, when we talk about imperialism, when we talk about US imperialism, we mean a system in which the might of these so-called first world countries, the wealth of these first world countries is entirely dependent upon a parasitic relationship with the rest of the life on this planet, including you and I, if you are working class or colonized. So yeah, they're trying to save themselves as their situation is circling the drain. And this is what we are living through. So there's like all these like so-called checks and balances within like the US capitalist system that are intended to put like a check on this power. But we're also seeing in this. Oh my God, there's audio coming from somewhere. Bear with me while I figure out where that is. Oh God, it's so distracting. Hold on. I don't know where.
Y hoy ese es el mensaje, que este
I feel like I was on a roll. Bear with me for the technical difficulties while I figure out where that audio is coming. Is this? Is it this? Can y'all hear that? Jesus. Wait, 1 second. I'm gonna put the loading screen on, and I'm gonna find this was the audio. I am back. It was on Twitter. Anywho, so yeah, there's all these checks and balances that are supposed to be like built into the US government to prevent the president from acting like a dictator or doing his own thing. Trump is really demonstrating like the brittleness of those checks and balances, but also how even when he just like completely ignores it, does his own thing, breaks all the rules that we all were taught are supposed to be in place, anytime there's an opportunity to stop him, both sides refuse to do it. And so the latest example of this is that there was a war powers resolution, which would basically restrict Trump's ability to initiate a war against Cuba, initiate military attacks against Cuba without the approval of Congress. That was put forward into Congress this week, and it failed every single time. And the same thing actually happened, for folks paying attention, with a war powers resolution in Iran. Trump and the Zionist entity started a war on Iran, just like unilaterally by surprise, didn't tell Congress, which is supposed to approve all military action by the president, didn't tell Congress. And then after the fact, Congress like tried to, people put forward into Congress like this war powers resolution to try to like attempt to stop Trump from doing that. And that failed as well. It failed as well. And people will say, you know, Republicans control the House and the Senate, and that's why it be failing. But every single time, like some kind of way to check Trump, check these people is on the table at like the exact right number of Democrats will hop to the other side to prevent it from happening. And it's like a rotating cast. Like this time it was John Fetterman, unrepentant, like proud Zionist, like just literally a huge piece of garbage. also hopped to the Republican side to make sure that this war powers resolution was defeated. It was him this time. It's someone different every time. And it literally happens every time. And I'm like, that's clearly planned out. Isn't that clearly planned out? Like, come on. Come on. Like, anyway, so this they always find a way to work across the aisle to make sure that imperialism continues, to make sure that war making can continue. And you can just say, oh, it just so happens to be that way, but that's a very, very naive position if it happens every time. And the other thing we have to understand, whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans, is that they don't work for us. They work for the US government, and the US government depends on imperialism to have its base of power, to have its wealth, to project its force around the world, to control what kind of governments people have, what kind of economic situation people have. Like, they work for the US government, and the US government is imperialist. And so, of course, they are always going to allow imperialism to happen. And if you notice, if you watch like Meet the Press, if you watch like MSNBC, if you watch like CNN, Fox News, all across the spectrum, people may be saying, oh man, this Iran war is a disaster. Like, this is not going well. We are losing. But none of them questioned in the first place the idea of attacking Iran, the idea of saying that we should get to decide whether Iran can develop nuclear technology. Like, everybody is united on repressing and demonizing and attacking Iran. They just don't like that that's not going well, and they don't like who's doing it in a lot of cases. They are, however, united with imperialist attacks on Iran, and they're also united with imperialist attacks on Cuba. And that's why that war powers resolution failed. And there were many organizations within the National Network on Cuba that rightfully organized to call congresspeople to say that you need to vote in support of this war powers resolution to make sure that Trump does not attack Cuba without the approval of Congress. Like, that work is very important because we have to build visibility, we have to build pressure, we have to build power and put these demands forward so that when our movement is strong enough, we can make sure they can happen, they can be on the table. So that work is important, but we also have to understand, like I said, these people do not work for us. They work for the war machine. They work for imperialism. They will always support it from both sides of the aisle. They both are on the same team at the end of the day, and it's not ours. And the other example of this that I want to give is that, a lot of like the capitalist media in the United States is very openly critical of Trump. Even like the right-wing capitalist media, like the Wall Street Journal editorial page, the Washington Post editorial page, is increasingly critical of Trump, especially when it comes to like this massive failure in Iran. Like, they're very openly critical of him, but not questioning the idea of attacking Iran, like I said. However, they still, when he gets a wild hair up his butt, when the DOD starts saber rattling, will provide that ideological rationalization, that ideological alignment to get the masses to support imperialist intervention in Iran, imperialist intervention in Cuba. And an example of this that I want to put on the screen right now, hopefully this works, is that Time magazine chose this week to release this article. Like, this article is called The Cuba Question, and there were 3 additional articles, all on Cuba, basically saying, while, it looks like Cuba's going to fall, they're suffering real bad right now, things aren't looking good. So let's talk about what Cuba could have besides a revolution. Like, what happens after the Cuban Revolution falls, with the foregone conclusion being the Cuban Revolution is going to fall. And then you can see like the picture that they led with on this article, garbage piled up in Havana, because as we know, because of the oil blockade, they literally don't have the gas to put into garbage trucks to send them around the city to pick up trash. And so even this very like leading image that they chose to put on their just spitball of what if the Cuban Revolution dies article is meant to produce a particular response in an uninformed audience, even though, again, this was intentionally constructed by the United States. And then the 3 articles, you can see, oh my God, I feel like these pictures are beautiful. And I also feel like this is like how the majority of the rest of the world lives, because like I said, the wealth of imperialist countries, the power of imperialist countries is based on a parasitic relationship with the rest of the planet. And so people see this and they're like, oh my God, the poverty, it's so dirty. And I'm like, y'all, made it this way. And also these people have free healthcare and free education. Do you? Anywho. So like I said, there's like 3 additional articles included. This is just like the overall like summarizing article. And the 3 additional articles included basically have one person who is living in Cuba, and that is actually the only person. His name is Leonardo Padura. He is it this one? Yeah. He's like a Cuban author, and he's also the only one that mentions in this article, in Cuba to be or not to be, the blockade. He's the only one that mentions the naval blockade, the oil blockade, and the maximum pressure campaign. And then the other 2 are like the right and left wings of the Cuban diaspora, and they're both anti-revolution. So I shouldn't say like right and left wing. It's like the right wing of the right wing and the left wing of the right wing, because one is like, Trump is saying, the Western Hemisphere is ours, and this is the time to take Cuba. This is it. The hour has come. It's time for Cuba's dictatorship to meet its ends. No ifs, and or buts. No deals of any kind. Get out, dinosaurs. Get lost. Disappear. Fossilized in the trash heap of history. And then the other one is like a very similar perspective, but he's like, Cuba has really strayed from the values of the revolution, and we have to recognize that we are too committed to socialism, and we really need to think about individual rights and also investment opportunities for members of the Cuban diaspora. So like I said, one is like the right wing of the right wing, where they're like, do what you did in Venezuela, go in there, kidnap Diaz-Canel and his wife, beat her up, because that's what they did to Celia Flores, kill 100 people in 45 minutes, because that's what they did in Venezuela, and then allow Marco Rubio to become the new president of Cuba. And then the other guy is like, socialism doesn't really work that much, so let's bring in like some private business. Let's bring in some investment opportunities for us. Let's bring in some liberalization of the Cuban economy. But they're both essentially arguing for the overthrowing of the Cuban Revolution, or the compromising of the Cuban Revolution to capitalist interests. And this is who Time magazine chose to platform. And so people can say Trump is like in a league of his own in terms of imperialism, in terms of war making, in terms of hostility to the rest of the planet. And I would say in response, he's just like much more blunt about it than we are used to, because Barack Obama, Joe Biden, Time magazine, MSNBC, they will soften the message. They will couch it in more progressive terms, but they are ultimately making the same argument that Trump is, which is that the US has the right to determine what kinds of government system Cuba should have, and it will not be socialism, that Cuba should allow the infestation of US capital, the exploitation of Cuba's resources, that they should destroy the social safety net that the Cuban Revolution has built for the Cuban people, that the Cuban Revolution, or the Cuban people, in fact, built for themselves through the Cuban Revolution, and that ultimately the Cuban Revolution should not exist anymore because they don't like it. They want to make money off Cuba, and the revolution is in the way. So like I said, it's an example of like the Times Magazine feature of articles on Cuba is an example of how even when we treat the US president like a mad king, like we act like Trump is the problem in and of itself, and it's like an exceptional thing, we have no idea how we got here, the whole system itself backs him up no matter where he goes, no matter how low he goes, no matter if he wants to bomb a school and kill 150 schoolgirls, they're going to do it. They're going to do it because ultimately this is an imperialist country, and that is what these structures exist to sustain. In the meantime, with these military threats, with the U.S. media helping to back up the military threats, helping to make the case for regime change in Cuba, Cuba is also still continuing to live through intentionally genocidal oil blockade and maximum pressure campaign targeting the island. Like that is currently what's happening. But there have been bright spots. For example, Russian oil made it to Cuba in March, and now the lights are on in Havana thanks to that Russian oil and the rapid expansion of solar power infrastructure in Cuba with China's help. So the Russian sent oil ship. The U.S. is like, don't do it. And they were telling Cuba, you're not allowed to take that. And Cuba was like, okay. And the Russians were like, okay. And the ship docked and they dropped off the oil. And you know what the U.S. did? Nothing. Nothing. And they'll say, oh, Trump was like, oh, things are really bad, so we were just throwing the bone. But what that was is that they did not want the smoke. They were not interested in initiating a direct confrontation with Russia over oil for Cuba. They weren't trying to do it. They already got whipped in Ukraine. They're currently getting whipped in Iran. They're just like, you know what? We don't want those problems. That is what that was. They will never admit it, but that is what that was. So the Russian oil made it to Cuba. The lights are on in Havana. And another really, really big piece of news in terms of Cuba's building its own capacity, the Cuban Revolution building its own capacity to meet the needs of its citizens. This week, the Cuban government announced that they have successfully figured out how to refine the crude oil that Cuba itself produces. Cuba is now refining its own crude oil, not oil that's imported to Cuba on a ship, but oil that Cuba itself can drill for, they're able to refine. But up until this point, they were able to because it's like really heavy. So they were only able to use it for like particular purposes. But now, thanks to the innovation, the scientific innovation made possible by the Cuban Revolution's investment in the Cuban people, they are now refining their own oil. They're producing their own gas, their own diesel, all like materials from their own crude oil. This is happening alongside, again, that extremely rapid development of Cuba's solar power infrastructure. So they are getting support from China, from Russia, from Mexico, from Vietnam, from the U.S.-Cuba Solidarity Movement, from the global Nuestra America Convoy. They're getting support from solidarity forces, but they are also focused on building their own capacity to meet their own needs. Because what the oil blockade revealed is that if you are dependent upon a resource that the U.S. empire or any imperialist nation can control your access to, that is a point of weakness because these people have no limit. They will go for anything. They will starve and kidnap babies. They will do anything to try to repress you. And so you have to figure out a way to meet your own needs and build international solidarity independent of imperialist forces. And that's precisely what Cuba has done. I feel like they don't get enough credit for, first of all, the situation where that has been intentionally constructed for them to fail, to put so much pressure on their system, to cause so much suffering for the Cuban people. Like the Mallory Memorandum says, that they give up on their own revolution and overthrow their government. So these are the conditions that Cuba is forced to deal with, conditions of genocide, intentionally constructed. And in response, the Cuban Revolution, guided by scientific socialism, baby, is able to organize Cuba's limited resources to still figure out how to meet the needs of those people, to still make sure that they have access to healthcare, to housing, to education, leagues above that available in capitalist countries. So just like they don't get enough credit for this moment in history, Fidel Castro long past, the Cuban revolutions are standing on its own and organizing itself to survive. Yes, it's making mistakes. If you and I built the revolution, it would be riddled with mistakes. I guarantee you, but it would still be better than living under submission, than living under colonization. The Cuban Revolution really needs to be studied and learned from because so many things are thrown at Cuba, and Cuba continues to survive, continues to innovate because they invested in their people. They invested in life. That's what that was. And just like that video that I showed at the beginning, talking about the Cuban people organizing to get millions of signatures to say that we don't want any U.S. military intervention on our island. Today, hundreds of thousands of Cubans and members of the solidarity movement from around the world are gathering for International Workers' Day. There are a huge, huge, huge march. Thousands of people in Havana. There are marches in every single province on the island, and there are also multiple brigades making up the International May Day Brigade in Cuba right now, gathered for this working class holiday. It is Cubans and people that are in solidarity with Cuba standing side by side, marching side by side, celebrating side by side, and saying, we refuse to be recolonized. We refuse to be exploited. We refuse to be submissive to capitalists and pedophiles, baby. We are going to be an organized and united and powerful working class. So right now, like I said at the top of the show, comrades, Ermia and Jasenia, my co-hosts on the Revolution Within the Revolution podcast, are in Cuba right now. They are part of the U.S. contingent of the International May Day Brigade, organized by the National Network on Cuba. We organize the U.S. contingent only. The International May Day Brigade has contingents from all over the world, all converging on Cuba for International Workers' Day. Leading up to the U.S. contingent departing for Cuba this past Sunday, actually, they just left, there was a nationwide solidarity car caravan that the Action Committees for Cuba organized. The Action Committees for Cuba are basically like local outposts of the NNOC across the country. And so they successfully delivered hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of material aid. And we have a short clip of them dropping off that aid in Cuba earlier this week. Oh my God. So over $500,000 in material aid for the Cuban people was gathered with the Caravans for Cuba campaign organized by the Action Committees for Cuba. And they dropped off that aid in a charter plane. Like they got a whole charter plane, filled it with $500,000 in material aid, took it to Cuba, landed, and then started the brigade. Oh my God. The inspiration, the power, like these grassroots efforts, 12 cities across the country, like you saw on the slide. So proud of those comrades. And then the video that was on the slide was just like literally members of the U.S. contingent of the May Day Brigade loading over $500,000 of aid into box trucks in Havana. They did that. Shout out to the Caravan for Cuba. And then the May Day Brigade is on the ground right now, learning about the Cuban Revolution, building people-to-people ties with the Cuban people, and also building people-to-people ties with other international brigades. And our comrade Ermia has been posting reels on the National Network for Cuba Instagram, just sharing some of the experiences of the May Day Brigade. So I'm going to play one of those right now.
The brigadistas are engaging in solidarity work with the Cuban people. Let's go talk to the people and see what they're up to. Brigadista. What are you here doing today?
Today we're at an urban garden in Havana.
Alongside several other international delegations, we're weeding plants across the land right now to stand in material solidarity with Cuba, the Cuban people, and their revolution.
Tell me, what's the importance of solidarity work?
The importance of solidarity work is to give back some of the solidarity that Cuba has shared with the world. The importance of solidarity work is because of the U.S. blockade, the Cuban people are not able to import their own food, so they have to create their own urban gardens in order to produce food for their people to continue on the revolution.
The importance of solidarity is not just helping others directly, but also learning skills to bring home to our people and our communities.
Cuba sí, bloqueo no.
Cuba sí, bloqueo no.
Cuba sí, bloqueo no.
Unrelenting cuteness. That was again my Revolution Within the Revolution podcast co-host Ermia on the ground, part of the U.S. contingent of the International May Day Brigade. They were supporting in an urban garden alongside Cuban comrades and comrades from other international brigades also there for International Workers' Day in Cuba. So Jasenia and Ermia are going to be back when the May Day Brigade is over, and they will have much more to report back, I'm sure. But just wanted to share that highlight of the really important work that's happening in solidarity with the Cuban Revolution. It continues despite Trump saber rattling, threatening Cuba, DOD sending drones, oil blockade, maximum pressure campaign. Solidarity continues. You cannot blockade solidarity. You will not stop us traveling to Cuba and organizing in support of the Cuban Revolution. It will not stop. As a matter of fact, after the May Day Brigade, the National Network on Cuba and the Centennial Brigade are sending 150 people to Cuba for Fidel Castro's 100th birthday. And we're going to bring even more material aid, and we're going to celebrate Fidel. So it doesn't stop, can't stop, won't stop until the blockade falls, until all U.S. attacks on the Cuban Revolution fall, until Guantanamo is closed forever, until Cuba is permanently removed from the list of state sponsors of terrorism. We will not stop. But I talked about International Workers' Day a couple of times, and maybe you're watching and you're like, what is that? And maybe I should have explained at the beginning, but I'm going to explain it now. So what International Workers' Day is a celebration of the global working class. It is a working class holiday. It is a holiday in the global struggle for socialism. That is what International Workers' Day is, from east to west, from north to south. That is what it's about. It happens every single year on May 1st. It also happens to be today, the full moon in Scorpio. I don't know if people are into astrology, but very significant pairing for me. Very significant pairing, especially because Scorpio is so much about like owning your power. And we as the global working class need to come together, need to own our power, need to realize that none of this stuff runs without us, that we really have the power of the situation. We need to get organized. So this pairing is very like, it's hitting for me. The full moon in Scorpio and International Workers' Day, May Day. But history of how International Worker Days came to be, it was chosen May 1st, the date was chosen by the American Federation of Labor to commemorate a general strike that was held in Chicago in support of the fight for an 8-hour workday. Workers in Chicago, including Wobblies, members of the industrial workers of the world, gathered in Chicago to push for an 8-hour workday. And in response, as the police tend to do, the police attacked the workers. That is what they be doing every time people gather for justice, gather against concentration camps, against ICE, gather against police terrorism. Here come the police killing the vibe and hurting people. So that's precisely what happened on that fateful day in Chicago. It's known as the Haymarket Massacre. And in response, the global working class movement chose to commemorate that day as a holiday in the international class struggle. It spread far and wide beyond Chicago, across the world, across the working class movement. And now in the present day, it is celebrated all over the United States, all over the Americas, all over Asia, all over Africa. It is an international working class holiday. So the International May Day Brigade, that is organized by Cuban Solidarity Forces all over the planet, is one way that the working class comes together to celebrate International Workers' Day. In other cities, it has been looked like marches of unions and immigrant rights groups and social justice organizations. It's also looked like rallies and mass mobilizations. This year in the United States, we are seeing like a really, really exciting resurgence of May Day, of International Workers' Day. Like it has always been held down by unions, by national liberation organizations, by immigrants' rights groups. Like they are always coming out for International Workers' Day. But now, at least me, like I'm seeing like much more mainstream support, much more mainstream owning of May Day, not just as May Day, but as International Workers' Day. I am seeing marches with not just like workers' demands or like traditional workers' demands, like a living wage or better benefits, but also demands against immigration detention, against ICE, against the war in Iran. So now we're seeing anti-imperialist demands in International Workers' Day. And before that was only happening in like a few places. And now it's like big mobilizations across the country raising explicitly anti-imperialist demands. I'm like, okay, this is growth. I feel very like optimistic at this point in history in terms of the consciousness of the masses. Even the fact that all of us are on the same page about Iran being in the right when it comes to the U.S. and Zionist war in Iran, everybody's rooting for Iran. Like I never thought I'd see the day because they demonize Iran so hard. And people are like, nope, we're Team Iran, like regular people. So I feel like there's like this we're in this moment of rising anti-imperialist consciousness being paired with class consciousness in a way that we have needed for a long time and that we have not had for a long time. And I actually think it's very, very, very exciting that this May Day is a manifestation of that. And so now we are seeing across the United States this call for a general strike on this day, mobilizations on this day saying no work, no school, no shopping, no war on Iran, no ICE, no blockade. Like people bringing so many struggles together on this expression in this day that's about expressing working class unity. Like we are building the movement that needs to exist. Now we just got to get more organized and more militant. We got to realize you can't just solely vote and get Democrats in office. You got to build power for your class, and that's going to take more than voting. So very exciting. So like I said, International Workers' Day is like a working class holiday. It's spread all across the world. It is experiencing a resurgence in the United States. It is also a huge, huge deal in Cuba because Cuba is a living socialist revolution. Cuba is an anti-imperialist revolution that successfully defeated U.S. imperialism, and Cuba is also a gathering point for progressive and anti-imperialist forces from all over the planet. And International Workers' Day, May 1st, is like one of those points when we come together in Cuba to build our movement. So it is a key point, especially in like this period of intense escalation of the U.S. war on Cuba, for Cubans and people in solidarity with Cuba to gather on the island to celebrate, to connect, to build relationship with each other, and to recommit to the global fight against capitalism and imperialism, to build our consciousness and our unity and our power as the global working class to defeat capitalism, to defeat imperialism. And I just watched this really incredible, it was like a roundtable discussion. I'm gonna like ruin the butcher the person's name, so I'm just gonna put a link in the chat. But it was a roundtable discussion hosted by a comrade in Canada, I believe, Radhika Desai of the Geopolitical Economist YouTube channel. But she hosted a roundtable discussion of some forces from the Cuba Solidarity Movement, some heavy hitters, including Isaac Saney from the Canadian Network on Cuba, and then Helen Yaffe, who is the author of We Are Cuba, who, through watching that interview or that roundtable, confirmed for me that she is a hardcore communist, which of course she is, because her analysis is correct. It is on point. And usually you need dialectical and historical materialism tools of communist analysis to be that on point. So that confirmation was nice for me. I was like, okay, girl, I see you. But anyway, it was a very incredible roundtable discussion, very like energizing and motivating. And one of my favorite parts of the discussion, I just put the link in the chat and I encourage people to watch the whole thing. But one of my favorite points is Isaac Saney talks about how in order to defeat imperialism, we must fight for the national liberation struggles of nations resisting imperialism. How the Cuban Revolution was not just about improving the conditions of the working class, of the masses of people in Cuba, them organizing themselves to overthrow capitalism, to take their land back, to take back control of their labor, to take back collective and democratic control of their wealth, and to build a socialist society. It wasn't just a win for them, it was also a win in the global struggle against imperialism. Because like I said earlier, the US, European countries, the Zionist entity, like whatever Western imperialist nation you can think of, all of the wealth and power that they have, even really the land that they have, is a result of a parasitic relationship with the rest of the life on this planet. They literally have to, in order to be rich and powerful, first world nations, they have to steal land, they have to steal resources, they have to steal people. That's how they got rich in the first place. Shout out to Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, if you want like the play-by-play for Africa specifically. But that's really what it's about. And so if you think about, they have to like gather nations and steal people and steal land and steal resources. If those nations they are stealing say, actually, wait, we're going to control our own land, labor, and resources. You're not going to control it and extract from us. That weakens the imperialist entity. They literally can only survive with that parasitic relationship. And so if each of the hosts rips himself away, the parasite gets weaker and weaker and weaker. And so the Cuban Revolution, liberating itself from US imperialism and building an independent socialist project where Cuba's resources were used for the well-being of the Cuban people, was a win for the Cuban people, but was also a win for the global struggle against imperialism, which means it was a win for the global working class. And what Isaac Saney says is that we have to recognize national liberation of colonized nations as a primary strategy to defeat imperialism. We must support the national liberation struggles of nations that are being targeted by imperialism. That means supporting Iran. That means supporting Venezuela. That means supporting the Alliance of Sahel states. That means supporting all of the nations against the planet that are fighting back against Western imperialism, because Western imperialism is trying to take out all of us, and a blow to it anywhere is a win for everybody, a win for all life on this planet. So I just feel like that point is like really understated. And I was so glad but he said it like so directly and clearly, because I feel like we get, especially in the Western left, like bogged down in very usually uninformed critiques of what Cuba's doing. Like we have never lived through a situation where people are like trying to destroy all aspects of economic life, like intentionally cutting off access to basic things that people need to live, and still trying to have to figure out how to like keep the project going. Like the vast majority of us have not been in a position where we're trying to like organize resistance to something like that, but we think that we have clear analysis of like what's going to work and what's not, or like what they should be doing, and we get wrapped up all up in that. Or another really annoying thing is that as soon as like the pressure escalates, the U.S. attacks on Cuba escalate, you get all these people like wish casting about the fall of Cuba, like just like counting down the days, or like, it's going to be now. Is it going to be now? What would it look like if the U.S. invaded Cuba? Maybe Cuba's going to fall right. You know what I'm saying? Like instead of like looking at what Cuba's doing to defend itself, to survive, they're trying to call when Cuba will fall. And I'm like, that's like if someone's walking on a tightrope and you're like throwing things at them. Like, why is that what you're choosing to do? Why is that what you're choosing to do? So yeah, the uplifting the necessity of the Cuban Revolution as a project to weaken imperialism, as a project that advances the global class struggle, and as a project that we must defend as people oppressed by capitalism, because a blow to it anywhere is a blow to it everywhere. Like that's really what we should be doing. And also learning from Cuba, learning how they survived this, because the conditions that the empire is imposing upon the Cuban people, if you notice this, the blockading of the Strait of Hormuz, which was a direct consequence of the US and Zionist entity attack on Iran, is causing devastation in the global economy. And now we are seeing nations across the world imposing things like rationing of oil, of like limited hours for public life, talking about how they're entering a food crisis and they don't know what to do. These conditions of lack, these conditions of drastic shortages of food and oil caused by the US blockade on Cuba are also being spread across the world because of US imperialism. So it would behoove us to learn from the example of places like Cuba, like Iran, like Russia, like Palestine, as a matter of fact, because Palestine has been militarily defeating the Zionist entity as well, of the resistance of Hezbollah. We have to learn from all the forces that are fighting back, because these conditions are going to be visited upon all of us soon enough, because global capitalism does not have a solution for the crisis it creates. And another really amazing thing that Comrade Isaac Saney said in that video is that these people have the power to drastically destroy everybody's living conditions. And they will willingly do that if it means that they get to control, they get to keep their position, they get to keep their power. They will burn everything to the ground and rule over the ashes, is what Isaac Saney said. And I feel like we are seeing that unfold. We are seeing it unfold. And so again, we got to study the resistance, the people that are fighting back, the people that are putting these enemies on the ropes, to learn how they are doing it so that we can develop our own strategies to survive the short-term pain, that's the term the ruling class is using, in order to get to the after part where we can build an alternative. So hopefully that makes sense. National liberation, very, very necessary tactic in the global struggle against imperialism. Part of the reason why we have to fight for the Cuban Revolution, that model must live, that example must live. We have to believe that alternative to this madness can exist, and socialism is that. And Cuba is building it as we speak under just like remarkably devastating conditions and still succeeding. Oh yeah, and the other thing I want to say is I have an outline. That's why I keep looking off screen to make sure I stay on track. There's the Cuban Revolution, there's the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela, there's the Alliance of Sahel States, there's the resistance in Palestine, there's the successful resistance in Iran, defeated the US and Israel in a war they started. Iran won. They won. So there's all these like models of resistance showing us that it's possible to fight back against imperialism and like win, be successful. And then we also have models of the world that imperialism wants to build for all of us, for all of us. So an example of that in our hemisphere in Turtle Island is Puerto Rico. I was just in Puerto Rico with comrades from the May Day Brigade. Shout out to Miladies and Leo, two coordinators on the International May Day Brigade. And Miladies is also an African Puerto Rican revolutionary who has been taking brigades to Puerto Rico to help people understand the colonial conditions on that island. And Puerto Rico is both very important to support in terms of their national liberation struggle because the US uses Puerto Rico as like a staging base for military operations to destroy the rest of the continent. But it's also really important to support Puerto Rican national liberation because the conditions that US imperialism, that capitalism has imposed on Puerto Rico are the conditions they want to impose on Cuba and on all liberated territories. And so right now, Puerto Rico is governed by a junta and a governor that were not elected by the Puerto Rican people. They were imposed by the outside by US imperialist forces. And they basically exist to reorganize the Puerto Rican government and the Puerto Rican economy for extraction. So they have privatized the electrical grid under a Canadian company called Luma that can't even keep the lights on, baby. Cuba can't keep the lights on because the US is blockading the oil and the supplies they need to maintain their energy grid. And Puerto Rico can't keep the lights on because the US, the outside forces have decided that they want to prioritize Puerto Rico's resources, not for the people that live there, but for data centers and tourists and colonizers. The other thing that they are doing is systematically destroying Puerto Rico's social safety net and like the infrastructure that is investing in the Puerto Rican people. And an example of this that the Puerto Rican people are mobilizing against is that the University of Puerto Rico is the last remaining public university on the island. All of the rest of the colleges and universities are either religious institutions, which we should be familiar with the long history of colonization, weaponizing religion against people all over Turtle Island, all over Africa, all over Asia. So the University of Puerto Rico, UPR, is the last public university left. It's also much more affordable than the private and religious options. And so the junta has drastically reduced the portion of Puerto Rico's budget, which is used to fund the University of Puerto Rico. In the Constitution, it's supposed to be like 10%, but right now the University of Puerto Rico is getting like, I think like 4%. So like just like a much reduced budget for the University of Puerto Rico. They're basically trying to starve it of resources so it fails, so they can justify closing it. So there are only private universities left. However, the students, the staff, the professors, and also the workers on the 11 campuses of the University of Puerto Rico have peeped the game. And they're like, you are absolutely not going to set us up to fail, close this down, and destroy one of the last remaining public education options on this island, on this colony. It's very important to invest in education as a colonized people because you need to develop the skills and the knowledge and the context you need to understand how to transform your conditions. If they disinvest in public education, they can develop a population that they can more easily repress. They can more easily extract from. Like that is the point of going for education. And the students, the faculty, and the workers see this. And so they shut down every campus on the island of Puerto Rico. They had a mass gathering. It was probably like 1,000 people in San Juan, and they marched on the governor's mansion. I was there on Saturday. It was lit. Marched on the governor's mansion and said, you will absolutely not shut down the University of Puerto Rico. You will not disinvest in public education on this island. There is no Puerto Rico without the public University of Puerto Rico, and we are going to fight for this. And again, the condition of Puerto Rico under capitalism shows you what the US has in mind for Cuba, what the US has in mind for all these nations that are resisting imperialism, that are resisting exploitation. They want to suck everything out of our homes. They want to displace our families, our loved ones, our communities. They want to shut down all of our community spaces, all the places where we get educated, so they can do nothing but take and take and take and take from us until some natural disaster comes and wipes us out. Like that's literally the only plan that capitalism, that US imperialism has for us. And Puerto Rico really shows it. But it also shows you, like I said at the beginning of the program, that no matter how much you disinvest in the people, no matter how much you sanction them, no matter how many puppets you put in place to control them, no matter what you do, you can militarily occupy them. those people will not stop fighting back because you have made an existential fight, and no one ever just lays down and dies. Like, that's a colonizer lie. That's like a white man lie. We will always, always, always fight back, and that's what Puerto Rico shows. And Cuba, and Palestine, and the AES, and so many other examples around the world. We are really catching so many wins, and we should be proud. So this May Day Brigade, this International Workers' Day, is happening in a really important point for the global struggle for the working class, for poor people, for colonized people, the global struggle for justice, the global struggle against imperialism. This enemy is falling. U.S. imperialism is in decline, but that does not mean that it's no longer dangerous. It's actually more dangerous now because they're on their last legs and they know it. They're throwing out Hail Marys that are killing hundreds to thousands of people each time. And again, we cannot panic. We cannot give up. We cannot give into defeatism. We have to follow the example of the Cuban Revolution and get organized and unified. And so that is why so proud about the Caravans for Cuba, so proud of our comrades in the U.S. contingent of the International May Day Brigade, and so proud and informed by the Cuban Revolution and all forces around the planet fighting to resist imperialism. We're producing new successful strategies to fight back because we need it. This is our moment. This is the last chance really for us and for them. So I'm going to start moving to the close of the program. We got about 30 minutes left. I want to start pivoting to updates from the National Network on Cuba. So we are actively recruiting, or we were actively recruiting for the Centennial of Fidel Brigade. We are taking 150 people to Cuba, August 1st to August 15th. When I say we, I mean the Venceremos Brigade and the National Network on Cuba are joining forces to organize the Centennial of Fidel Brigade from the U.S. We have a joint responsable team made up of coordinators from the May Day Brigade and responsables from past Venceremos Brigade, as well as new folks that we are going to be training and developing to lead brigades. We have over 130 brigadistas. We are getting through the wait list and final list of approvals now to produce our final list of brigadistas. And we are about to launch our national fundraiser for the Centennial of Fidel Brigade. We want to raise funds to bring material aid to Cuba. Things like solar power lamps and batteries, things like paracetamol and acetaminophen that are hard to get because of the blockade, but that are necessary for medical care. We are going to get things like mosquito nets. We are going to get all kinds of school supplies, all kinds of material aid to bring to the island. And so any donation to our national fundraiser will help us bring even more material aid. We also want to make sure that the forces that are on the front line of the United States struggle for justice, poor and working class people, African, Indigenous, Palestinian, Latino people, Cuban Americans need to join the U.S.-Cuba Solidarity Movement, and we have several coming on the Centennial of Fidel Brigade. We recognize it's an expensive trip. It's $1,900, $1,950. International travel has typically been for privileged people, for petty B, European people, working class people, people with resources, you know what I'm saying? So we want to bring the front lines, the poor and working class, the colonized, and that means that we got to raise funds for partial scholarships to bring folks on this brigade. We want to help support the cost of this trip for the people that need it the most, the folks that are most marginalized, the folks that represent the front lines. And so any donation you make to the national fundraiser will also help us set off the cost of the brigade for the folks that need it the most. So stay tuned for that on NNOC and BB social media platforms. And please support our fundraising campaign for the Centennial of Fidel so you can bring brigadistas and material aid to Cuba. And so we can uphold the memory of Fidel Castro. It is not controversial here. We uphold Fidel on this platform. Shout out to Fidel Castro. The world is better because he lived. Point blank period. The other thing that's happening in the National Network on Cuba is our spring summer meeting. It's happening on May 30th. It's a Saturday from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern. And at that spring summer meeting, we will be discussing and voting on a new set of bylaws for the National Network on Cuba. The member organizations of the NNOC got the updated draft bylaws this week, I think yesterday, in their inboxes. They'll have about a month to review those new updated bylaws ahead of the vote. And essentially what we did to get to that new draft is we engaged in a battle of ideas, shout out to Fidel, within the NNOC, where we debated and discussed the different changes made to our bylaws, how to refine them, the different concerns that people had, the different positions that people had. We integrated all of that input into this updated draft that we distributed this week, and we will be voting on that draft Saturday, May 30th, 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern. So keep an eye out for that invite, and we hope to see every single member organization there, because we are developing a tighter and more organized and more unified future for our network that's going to help us grow. That's going to help us bring more movements, more organizations representing the front lines of the struggle for justice into the NNOC, into the Cuba Solidarity Movement. So yes, shout out to the Battle of Ideas. Shout out to all the member organizations and members that participated. And we are in the home stretch, culminating in that vote at the spring meeting on May 30th. Also, shout out to the Democratic Socialists of America, to ACERE, to the Hands Off Cuba Committee, and to more members of the National Network on Cuba for their work this week to mobilize folks to call their congresspeoples in support of that War Powers Resolution, attempting to check Trump's attempts to attack Cuba, to spread war around the world. That War Powers Resolution did fail in Congress. Like I said, these people are on the same team, and it's not ours, it's imperialism's team. However, the work that those member organizations did was extremely important. We must raise the struggle in every venue that we have. We need a multifaceted strategy to build the pressure and the power we need to take out the U.S. blockade on Cuba once and for all. That means we cannot abandon any terrain of struggle. We need people in Congress harassing these people to do the right thing, which, by the way, people who are really good about that is Code Pink, another member organization of the National Network on Cuba. If you follow them on Instagram, which you should, they have so many videos of them like vexing the hell out of these, like Nancy Pelosi, Marco Rubio, like different Congress people, different like warmongers, just like harassing them over U.S. attacks on other nations. It's so funny. It's so funny. Like they make Nancy Pelosi so mad, as they should. As they should, girl. Take an anti-war position for once in your life. So shout out to Code Pink and all the member organizations that have applied pressure on Congress people. Shout out to all the local and city-based organizations in the National Network on Cuba that have worked with city councils and council people to pass resolutions on the local and state level. Shout out to the Action for Cuba committees and the local committees for doing on-the-ground work in our communities to conduct political education about Cuba and to gather material aid and recruit for our brigades. Shout out to all the people's organizations and movements that occupy a lane within the Cuba Solidarity Movement. We are all fighting together. We are all using different strategies for the same objective, and that's precisely what is needed. So even though it's not successful, it is still building pressure, visibility, and power for us to win our demands. So moving to the closing of this program, I hope that you enjoyed me by myself. Next week, I'll also be by myself. And then the week after that, the comrades will be back and they'll be talking about the May Day Brigade. But next time on Revolution Within the Revolution, we're going to be talking about the gathering of the Ops of the Americas, which took place in January, aka the Shield of the Americas. It is a new formation formed by the Trump administration, gathering all of the puppets. Like they had the old girl from Trinidad, they had old boy from Ecuador, they had the puppet they just got in there in Honduras, gathered them all in South Florida, of course, because we really have the most reactionary diasporas from all across the world are concentrated in South Florida. Woo! It's bad. So they gathered there in South Florida with Trump and Rubio, and they basically committed to come together to take military intervention against nations attempting to resist imperialism in Turtle Island. Like that's quite frankly what it was. And so we're going to be talking in detail about that and what it means for the escalation of military threats against Cuba, what that might mean for what they will try and who will be involved. So that's going to be next Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern, same channel, same time, just me one more time. And then the other comrades will be back with a report from the May Day Brigade. And I just want to say thank you all so much for watching Revolution Within the Revolution. Please like and subscribe to our channel. Please share this video, help us spread the word, help us build our audience. This has been a program of the National Network on Cuba. My name is Onyesanwe Chatoye. I am a co-chair, one of 5 co-chairs of the NNOC. I'm an organizer with the Centennial Brigade. I'm an African woman resisting colonization, capitalism, and patriarchy, and I am in unrelenting solidarity with the Cuban Revolution, because the Cuban Revolution must be defended. So thank y'all so much. Have a good rest of your day. Bye.
Eran las 3 de la mañana, 3 de enero en el calendario. Caracas dormía tranquila bajo su manto diario, pero el cielo no trajo sol, trajo un ruido de metal, y en Fuerte Tiuna se rompió el silencio habitual. No fueron truenos de lluvia, fueron botas extranjeras que cruzaron sin permiso nuestras líneas y fronteras. La noticia corre como pólvora, la pantalla se congela. Se han llevado al presidente, hay fuego en Venezuela. Liberen a Nicolás, grita una parte del mapa, mientras la garra del norte su sentencia destapa. Dicen que va hacia el norte sobre el mar prisionero, en las entrañas de acero de un buque extranjero. Que el mundo se detenga, que nadie quede mudo, hoy la historia se parte. Liberen a Maduro. Hoy en Moscú escuchas el eco en el Caribe. Si cae un socio el equilibrio no sobrevive. Pekín levanta la vista, el dragón debe mirar que las flotas del imperio han vuelto a navegar. Hermano en La Habana, sandinista en Nicaragua, saben que esta misma lluvia mañana será su agua. Si hoy tocan a uno y lo sacan de su cama, mañana su justicia incendiará toda la rama. Dicen que el Iwo Jima navega con la presa, que van rumbo a Nueva York a servirlo en la mesa. Trump firma la orden, Petro mira con espanto. ¿Es justicia o es venganza lo que cubre con su manto? Las bombas en la Carlota dejaron su marca en el suelo. Un pájaro de hierro se lo llevó en pleno vuelo. Para el que celebra en Miami, para el que llora en el barrio, esto no es solo un hombre, es un cambio de escenario. La soberanía sangra cuando el juez es el verdugo, y la libertad no nace bajo la sombra del yugo. Venezolano, despierta, sea cual sea tu color. Hoy tu tierra fue pisada por la bota del invasor. El mundo aguanta la respiración, la moneda está en el aire. Nadie sabe el costo, nadie sabe el desaire. Desde el sur hasta el oriente, el mensaje